Right.
So,
Okay.
hello everyone. We're very pleased to have with us this evening Lucie Hoelmer, and Lucie's title, as far as I'm aware, she'll tell me if I'm wrong, is Senior Environmental Partnerships Officer with Leicestershire County Council. And we did bill this by talking about road verges. I would like to point out to people that Lucie is not the person who pushes the lawnmower, and she doesn't mow all the orchids down. And I know she wants to talk about more than road verges. She has other things that she wants to talk about this evening. So with that, I'll hand over to you, Lucie, and it's your presentation.
Okay, thanks very much, Alan. Yeah, I thought I'd talk a bit more than about verges when I was first asked to do this, because I thought people at Nature Spot would find quite a few things interesting in terms of what the County Council are doing, and you know, it's an opportunity to ask questions or put views across really about what you think could be done in the county. So I think, yeah, I see this as a bit of a, I'll tell you everything that I possibly can that is of interest possibly, and then we'll have questions at the end if that's okay. So yeah, I've picked some key areas of work that are happening at the moment to share with you, and I'll just run through. But my role is Senior Environmental Partnerships Officer, and I work within the environment team. We sit alongside transport, and the purpose of my role really is to take forward the aspect within the environment strategy that the County Council approved last year around green infrastructure, biodiversity and local environments. So that's things like air pollution and so on, and work around what our main areas of work are going to be to take that forward in terms of how we work with others. So it's not just about working in partnership with lots of departments in the County Council to make things happen, but to also work in partnership with other organisations, whether that be other local authorities or non-governmental organisations like the Wildlife Trust, the RSPB, in terms of furthering really change for biodiversity. And the big thing I would say about the environment strategy is its focus on the climate emergency and the need to do something around that, and also the biodiversity crisis. Those two topics are quite key to the County Council at the moment, and what I want to see going forward are some, I would say, big things to try and drive you know, the slowing down of these crises really, and if we can turn the tide, but they're very complex as we all know. So a lot of it is about going back to, well, what can we do, and assessing where we have influence and control, and seeing what we do now and whether we're doing it in the right way, and can we change now? Do we need, you know, what resources do we need to change, and so on. So that's really what my role is. And tonight I'll just talk about what we're doing with roadside verges in terms of that, and also around some of the schemes that we've launched this year, which you may or may not be aware of, to try and encourage more activity, particularly around biodiversity, and also to introduce the fact we've got a new tree strategy and some discussion around what we'd like to do with trees in the county in terms of helping and dealing with issues like the ash dieback and the oak processionary moth. So and I'll just touch on a few other things towards the end. So I'll kick off into the presentation. So as I said just a minute ago, and I think I know this is being recorded, but I don't know, I'll send these slides through to Alan so that he's got a copy if anybody wants to have a look at these links, because you won't, you can write them down, but you won't need to if they're circulated. And the first thing to say, as I say, is the environment strategy that the County Council approved and wrote last year has been slightly revised to try and bring into some action work around the climate emergency, mainly because the climate emergency was declared after the strategy had been written really. So it needed to change to reflect that political view on wanting to do something last year. And a lot of that came from the sort of movement that was started by Greta Thunberg. And So I'd urge you all, if you can, to have a look at that document, because it does sort of underpin why the county is taking more action. Again, the tree management strategy was launched this year, and that's really trying to get to grips with what we're doing with trees. You know, we own trees, we give advice to people who own trees, and we have a duty of care for some trees that are near the highway but aren't on our land. And so that management plan really is sort of explains what the responsibilities are. So if ever you are wondering about street trees, if they're on the highway and who's responsible and how they should be managed, it's worth taking a look at that strategy. And then in terms of the work that we're doing in the environment, so the tree management strategy is mainly led by our country parks and forestry team who wrote that document. The climate emergency and biodiversity crisis that sort of underpin in terms of the action that's outlined in the environment strategy is owned by the environment team. Clearly the whole council has signed up to the actions there. It's just that our team were tasked with writing it in essence. And then as you go down, what we're trying to take forward is a bit of a delivery plan for biodiversity, because when you read the environment strategy, it gives an indication of where work might be happening, but it doesn't say what and how much, if that makes sense. So part of my role is to actually go on and say what and how much we're wanting to do in terms of how do we want to support triple SIs, for example, in the wider landscape? How do we want to work to secure biodiversity in the wider landscape, as well as on our own property? And so the document I'm working on at the moment is to try and give people an idea of what that could look like. But I would also say that in the last 12 months, there's been a lot of change in government in terms of how it's approaching the biodiversity crisis. And I don't know whether any of you have seen the new nature recovery evidence handbook that's been released by Natural England, but it's worth taking a look at that. And again, I've put the link in, because that talks about nature recovery networks, and it talks about how local authorities can go about formalising a strategy and working together in all the areas that they have influence to do something about creating a nature recovery network. It's a really interesting document. So I'd urge you, I would say of all those things, the environment strategy gives a mandate for the county council to work on this, but that document at the bottom will probably be the most of interest to you guys. So in the meantime, whilst we're trying to develop the work around biodiversity and habitat in terms of a delivery plan, what will we actually do? There have been opportunities through my sort of engagement with people working in this area that we could take forward now. We haven't got to wait for a strategy to be politically adopted, because I do have a remit to work in this area. So some of the things that we've been doing in the last I started with the County Council in May last year, are sort of listed on this slide here. So we've taken a particular approach to roadside verges in terms of how we manage that asset, which probably some of you who have been studying wildflowers along verges for some time will have noted that they have been quite neglected over the years in terms of how they're managed. And I think that's probably very much down to resourcing, but also understanding the management that's needed to improve for biodiversity and for habitat and so forth. And then we've introduced this in this last 12 months, the Shire Environment Grant. We had a grant before, and it was very much focused on things like reducing carbon emissions from changing your lighting to, say, solar power. It was more about insulating community buildings and so on. But this year they've introduced a theme called biodiversity, which really is giving people an opportunity to apply for money to help them do something around. It could be a community that look after a recreation ground. It could be a garden that people have taken on a long lease, which is a community garden. I mean, it's got to be public land in essence, so that it's not going to be sold off and the money then basically wasted because somebody's decided then to build a house on it. You can imagine it has to be some land that's in custodianship for nature. But it's really a great opportunity. It's about £3,000 is the maximum that we would give out for any one grant. But if you're looking for if you've got a project and you could be looking at it, could be £20,000 project, but you need match funding or contributory funding, this is a really good source to apply to. And I will go into a bit more detail on that later on in the slides. We're trying to change the way we act with our customers, so understanding where we have interfaces with organisations that we could actually help them to make changes in the way they manage. So we're looking at the way we look after land and biodiversity, but we're also trying to help others. We're reviewing all the areas of business across the County Council to see how they work now and whether we can tweak the way they work to do more for biodiversity. And then we've done some projects in the last few months around great crested newts, working along the lines of nature recovery, which I can talk about later. And we are very much involved with HS2 as a consultee. And my colleague, who some of you will know, Sue Timms, is the ecological expert, and she will be looking at the planning side. A lot of it is in confidence, we can't share. We're under a non-disclosure with the organisation HS2 Limited. But when we get plans that we see, obviously Sue has a lot of local knowledge, and she will interrogate those plans and try and understand where improvement could be made. So that's quite helpful for us. And we also have groups, we are talking to lots of other organisations to try and do what we can there. So there are things going on in the background, as well as this sort of long-term strategy making work that we're doing. So onto Verges. I just thought I'd give a bit of a background to how the County Council currently, or yes, I would say up until the end of last year really, was managing Verges. We were cutting our visibility displays quite frequently for health and safety reasons. We have to do that under regulation. We were cutting mainly our verges in urban areas for amenity reasons. So this is based on people wanting verges to look tidy, you know, be able to retrieve litter from the verges and so forth. And then we got a rural regime, cutting primarily for maintaining open verges. You know, making sure people could actually walk along them, hence the metre sort of setback that was cut quite regularly. And you can see on the slide the sort of frequency of cuts. I won't go into the detail there. But for the last so many months, we talked quite intensively. Myself, there's been a sort of working group within the county to look at how we can change the urban and the rural regime to improve the verges for habitat, for biodiversity, for flora and fauna. And that, as we know with the guidance, we follow very much the guidance from Plant Life, is really about still cutting at least once a year, but at the right time of the year in the autumn, when sea heads have had the chance to drop and so forth. Not leaving the arisings on the verges and removing that extra nutrients that would be otherwise going into the soil. And then obviously we'll still need to do every few years a full cut, particularly at the back, to remove woody growth. But it's more of a sensitive way of managing. And we feel that if we can get that right for a trial period and understand the implications of, well, where do you dispose the grass cuttings, and where do you, you know, what's the logistics involved with that in terms of number of trips it takes for tractors to go in and out and so on, we'll understand the overarching costs that might be needed to formulate a wider plan. So we've selected a number of verges on this rural trial. We're only, when I talk about the rural areas, I'm talking about those that are out of the 30-mile-an-hour zone. I'll just page down, bear with me. So those areas in the rural areas, we very much needed to understand with our contractors what sort of machinery they might have access to, because we are tied into a contract already with a particular couple of firms. And so there's quite a lot of challenges with understanding, in terms of why we wanted to do the trial. Some of these challenges that I've put up on the screen explain why it was difficult to just introduce a regime straight away. So first of all, there were fears over the cost, which I was talking about earlier. If we can understand what the costs are for a new set of logistics, if you like, around this, then we could potentially scale it up. The other side is the public perceptions, because we have a mixed bag really of people ringing into the county council about verges. Some people want them cut almost like a bowling green, and other people are quite happy to let them grow longer and see different things growing in them as they grow. And so we felt that rather than introduce something radical, we wanted to educate people along the way as we went, and sort of make people aware of why certain areas need to be kept longer and get them to engage with it. And then the other side to this is we wanted to, you know, in terms of challenges for wildflowers, we've been in touch with lots of local authorities all over the country, and very many do things quite differently. I spoke to Coventry, for example, and they sow a lot of wildflowers that are annuals, and every 4 years they have to go back and rip it all out and re-sow it again. And it's not really a natural, sustainable approach. And we felt, from a Leicestershire point of view, what we wanted to do was improve the management and give that gradual chance for species to colonise and grow in a more natural way that became perennials, and people get used to seeing those sorts of species rather than buying in. You know, you could, I dare say, if you wanted to get wildflowers, you can go online and you'll see lots of hybrids that you can buy in packets and spread, but they don't necessarily succeed for lots of reasons, and it's not natural. They're not part, a lot aren't native, and they're not necessarily responsive to the soils in the areas they're in. So we wanted to make this a much more gradual approach, really, and sustainable. And then we really need to understand the type of machinery that's available and where topography might be an issue, what sort of machinery would be available to us in those areas, and understand, have a bit of a strategic plan around, well, where are we going to dispose it. We looked at the idea of biodigest approach, which is what they've done in Lincolnshire. But that's very complicated because there are very few of those around that can actually take the grass waste. It's a chemical process, quite complicated, and so maybe in the fullness of time there might be that technology in Leicestershire that we could do that with, but at the moment we're looking at green waste sites, so taking our cuttings to green waste sites so that at least it's used for composting. So those are the sorts of challenges that we faced when we wanted to look at how verges could contribute to biodiversity within the county. So in terms of I talked a bit about the rural verge where we're working with contractors. So this year we've gone to our contractors, we've given them some key areas where we'd like to trial the change in cutting regime, and then we would see then next year what the impacts. Now, it's not going to be overnight, as you can imagine. It may take a few years before we see any ecological change, I would suspect, but at least we'll have trialled the process involved. And then going back to the urban verges, we felt that because of the concerns around public opinion, we wanted to see if communities would come forward themselves and work with those. So work with initially to see how we would license somebody else to look after a verge or get involved with a project. We put the call out to parishes because obviously we do have relationship with parishes where we cut for them, and we got quite a lot of interest. You know, it was a good amount of interest, but then when they started to go into further detail with it, and when we went out to look at where they wanted to do it and whether it was practical to do what we wanted to do in those areas, we've narrowed it down to about 12 of the people who came, 12 of the parishes. So it's not major enough, but it's a good start. And in all those circumstances, the parishes will manage those verges themselves, but they will also be telling the communities about what they're doing. So it's about educating the local people as to why it's important as well. And just looking at what we're doing in terms of working with Nature Spot, because you're a very focused organisation around people contributing from the community and a way of recording change in terms of biodiversity locally, we felt it would be a really good opportunity to work with you on a sort of citizen science approach to evaluating the verges with the parishes and to build those relationships with people. So I've worked with Dave Nichols to come up with a methodology. We started this today actually. It's not a roadside verge, but it's a verge that's been left to wildflower areas to sort of assess them for their species abundance. And that work, this next month, the plan basically is to go out and assess all these verges that have been selected for managing for wildflowers, and then come back next year or later on this year and next year and assess them again to see what's been done in the meantime. And a lot of the approach really that parishes are taking is following the plant life guidance. So they're looking at where there are areas of poor quality in terms of species, variety, scarifying and potentially adding species in. But what we've been really careful to do is guide them to sites where you can actually get the native species of plant as opposed to producers of that. And of course, as a county council, we have to be quite careful about recommending certain organisations or companies for that, but there are websites available that list. I don't know whether everybody's seen the Q website on the various organisations that you can purchase wildflower seeds, but if anyone's interested, I can send them the details. So what we're trying to do there is sort of it's working with local people, because there was a real chance, I suppose, that in some ways, you know, organisations, people can go off and do their own thing, but then they don't do the right thing in terms of buying seeds and planting. So maybe this will also help people to think, right, well, if I'm doing this in my garden, this is the sort of approach that I might want to take, or if I'm doing this in a local recreation ground that isn't a roadside verge, then I'd follow that sort of approach. It's really about getting the word out, I think, in terms of the Verge Trials in the urban areas. So, yeah, I think I've pretty much covered everything there on that. In terms of trees, what we've recognised in our environment strategy is, and grassland, I think, is an area where we need to do more research on measuring the impact of grassland, species-rich grassland on carbon sequestration and storage. But trees obviously been recognised for their biodiversity value within the tree strategy. It talks about mature trees, veteran trees needing to be protected, and important really, it's being more and more recognised trees are important for natural flood management and air quality improvement. Although many people in the air quality world work in public health would say really what we want to do is reduce the amount of particulates they're getting in the air as opposed to relying on trees to remove them, which is a fair point. But obviously where you still have them, trees can be very effective in providing a barrier, particularly on very busy roads or roads that suffer a lot of traffic and congestion. And then, of course, we recognise them. We have a woodland strategy, although it's slightly outdated now. There is a woodland landscape strategy for Leicestershire, and we recognise their importance in the landscape and their importance in placemaking. You know, we have the National Forest within Leicestershire, and that's a really important brand, and has been a change for some of our, you know, in terms of regenerating some of our landscapes. So I think trees, particularly at the moment, are already a hot topic in any government rhetoric, but certainly within the county. We feel they've obviously got a lot of representation in lots of other areas. I think for me, I'd like to see more of other landscape and habitats being represented there in terms of what they can provide. And we are going to, as a county, invest more in tree planting, but some of that is because we've already got a really good relationship with the Woodland Trust, who can leave the funding in to help us do that across Leicestershire, supporting farmers and parishes to plant more trees. And of course, that will help us respond to the ash dieback issue, which in certain areas is probably going to be worse than others. And we are seeing instances where ash are recovering, which is good to see. But of course, we've also now got the oak processionary moth that's entered the UK. So we need to be thinking about how we plant for that and support keeping trees in the landscape. And one of the things that we feel that, well, I certainly feel, having seen where we are with our information about trees, is that we probably need to update the records around some of the condition of our veteran trees across Leicestershire. And what we are trying to do, and I'm working on a piece of procurement at the moment, is to acquire something called the National Tree Map, which is a piece of clever aerial mapping LiDAR data, which provides an algorithm that tells you the size and canopy size of every tree. So it can identify individual trees, which will really help us to understand the stock, if you like, across Leicestershire. What it doesn't do is provide species, and that's where we still need to rely on people going out and recording those, on understanding what's there, but then looking at what species are where. And that's where our tree wardens currently in Leicestershire as a network are really important to help. And anybody else that has an interest in trees, may not be a tree warden, but doesn't mean to say you can't go out and record important trees in the landscape. So those are some of the things that we're trying to continue. We still want to sustain the tree wardens, but we're wanting to also open up more to the county council run an environmental action volunteer group, which were essentially about composting, but we're widening out the opportunities that they could actually help and support with some projects around recording and getting the message out there really about biodiversity within the landscape. So it's trying to get lots of people's hands to the pump really, I think, in this cause to take things forward. So the Shire Environment Grants that I talked about earlier, I said I'd touch on this again. As I said, they focus very much in the past on sort of greenhouse gases and waste, but we're now talking more about biodiversity and trying to improve that with these grants. And in fact, this year we would have had 14 rounds, but because of COVID, we had to suspend them. So we had a round that finished, I think it was at the beginning of March, and then after that we couldn't launch the next round because we were concerned that people couldn't get together to work through their projects to enter the round, so we just suspended. There was a lot going on in terms of us all being sent home to work from home, and I think it was all too much the point to manage the grant, but we are going to be reopening those shortly. But what we found with the first round of this new approach to giving funding out for environment and including biodiversity was the majority of the applications were biodiversity applications, which is quite exciting. Well, that tells us that there's a real conscience out there to do something about this crisis, which is positive. And they were wide ranging. There were things like tree planting, some on roadside verges. A lot was around managing grassland better, introducing wildflowers where there were none, orchard planting, taking on bits of derelict land to turn them over for community gardens, but with a biodiversity sort of focus, if you like, or not organic, but the permaculture approach to community gardening, which is positive. And so, and other projects like potential pond restoration and so on that came forward. So we've got quite a broad area, really. Some people weren't all that, how can I put, they put things in too late and we had to turn it down because they didn't provide us with all the information. But with what we've said as a county council is, if you can develop those things, you'd be welcome to come back to future rounds, which is good, because I think the intention is to try and get people to do as much as possibly we can and support people in that process. Because obviously we want to make sure that projects are successful. So I'm looking forward to the next round opening, to be honest with you, so we can get further forward. Some of the projects that we had in there were roadside verge projects. So because we'd been promoting the idea of improving roadside verges, and parishes have come forward with those interested to take them on and get involved, they'd also applied for funding to help do that, whether it was buying protective clothing or seeds or machine or tools to do that work. Those are sorts of things that were coming back. So yeah, I would say that funding is going to be well embedded into the future, which is exciting. So I said I'll talk about other things. I'll just touch on, we're doing some training, which I think some of the people that have attended tonight are actually have actually attended, and they might want to feed back later what they think of it at the training that was undertaken. The first session was undertaken on Friday for the group. But why did we want to train parish councils? Well, we felt we'd done a survey last year about what parishes felt they needed support with around this, and they all came back with some key areas that they felt they needed advice and support on. And obviously parishes are a key influence in Leicestershire, as I've said on this slide, in as much as they own land, they are very close to local residents, they have statutory consultee opportunities on the planning applications. Many parish councils are being asked to support the neighbourhood planning policy process under the Localism Act, and they can campaign for change within the local area. So they're a good group of organisations to start with across Leicestershire, as well as working with the borough and the district councils. And as I say, in the survey, a lot of people come back and said, yes, we would like to know more about biodiversity in the law. We would like to know more about how to manage land better. And so those are some of the topics that we've covered in the training. And we've worked very much in partnership with Leicestershire Rutland Wildlife Trust to deliver this, because they're already giving advice to some degree to those organisations and have a breadth of knowledge in this area to support that now and going forward into the future. Some of the topics, as I said, are covered there. And we wanted local councillors to get very much involved with this as well, not just be focused at staff, but to really get the people who are involved with some of the decision making involved with the training. And so really where this sort of feeds in terms of, I suppose, the work that Nature Spot are doing is it's a real opportunity. We are pushing Nature Spot through the training to make those links with the parishes. I think you've got quite a few already. It's about 50 or 60 parishes that are involved with Nature Spot or have a parish website. But I think the more people and lay people that are aware of that, the better, really, in terms of being able to record and improve the records in Leicestershire, and also support people who might be interested in nature but haven't got masses of knowledge about it to learn more, which I think is really important. So that's something we've just started to do. We did the first training session on Friday last week, and we've got another one on the 10th of July. As I said earlier, we're reviewing how we do things. The country parks are writing management plans for each of the parks. So that's the parks such as Beacon Hill, Watermead, those Broombriggs Park. They're going to have a section with each management plan which will look at biodiversity. And to be honest, the country parks already do manage to some degree for biodiversity. Watermead, for example, has increased the size of its reed bed areas and does work on the reed beds as regularly as they can with volunteers to keep them from submitting to succession of woody plants and so forth. But we'd like to do more. We'd like to do more wildflower areas, talking about butterfly banks. And the work that we've done around great crested newts was involving country parks. So there's a real opportunity there for the county to do more. County farms, we own over 8,000 hectares of county farm. We have a lot of land as a landowner, and obviously it's tenanted. So those are businesses in their own right that manage that land for that purpose. However, there's a massive opportunity there to help and support, whether that's encouraging them to enter things like countryside stewardship grants, or other opportunities that come forward from government to support. And I want to try and measure really the impact of advice, support, and then implementation, and how well that works in terms of working with those areas. The other thing we're trying to do at the moment as part of our strategic approach to biodiversity is looking at the evidence base for nature. And that goes back to the document I mentioned earlier on, the Nature Recovery Evidence Base Handbook. It's bringing all of our knowledge together into one place to understand where it would be best to improve and expand. So if we're talking about expanding SSSIs, how much and how far? If we're talking about creating corridors, what's the rationale behind that creation of those corridors? One of the things I'm working on at the moment with the National Forest and Leicestershire Rutland Wildlife Trust is an ecological network map, which is based on some work done by a chap called Roger Catchpole a few years ago, and his methodology to understand the permeability of generic focal species within the landscape and how far they can move, and looking at the aerial mapping of Leicestershire and seeing where core habitats are and how far they can travel between and so forth. So we can at least just start a conversation off around that spatial view, and then look at how new development and certain farming practices can have a positive or negative impact on that, really, so we can start to plan for the future. And that may well help us with targets as well, in terms of percentage habitat cover that we could potentially improve if people make the right decisions. And that's key, isn't it? If you haven't got the evidence, you can't have the conversation. So it's quite important, really. And that goes back to the core of what Nature Spot do, which is recording where species are. So there's a real direct link between community action and decision making. I think we often, well, you know, people who are not involved may not necessarily see the value of that straight away. And I think that's something we should really talk about. And then looking at the key performance indicators for the county, we have some indicators around what are the condition of SSSIs and what are the condition of local wildlife sites. And we need to really think about the practicalities of whether those are driving change and whether we need to think about other indicators that could drive change more on that. And that's something that we need to review as a local authority. And then, as I said earlier, as part of my role, it's about being present in partnership where we feel we can make change. So again, we've got this panel on HS2, which we're looking at how we can do the best for Leicestershire there within the remit. As you know, HS2 are not bound to the biodiversity net gain law, the same as other projects across the UK. As a major infrastructure project, they don't have to provide a biodiversity net gain, but they, I think, from what I've seen, they're working hard towards that. But we need to make sure it's right for Leicestershire in what they're, you know, the detail, and that's why we need to have this panel and group of individuals sort of providing that external view, and then bridging the gap between organisations. So we've worked with Natural England, who have got a real overview of great crested newts and where they need to be sort of linked up, connected to improve habitat and the species the strength of the species. And I think what we've done in this last few months, had the opportunity at Christmas to look at how we could support, and it's literally just making the connections between the right people, you know, whether it's the property manager or the country parks rangers, to decide where we could make improvement to existing ponds, but also potentially new ones. And that's quite useful in terms of, with public land, of course, we're committed then to looking after them and taking them forward into the future, which is quite important. So that's been quite successful in the sense that we've actually secured sites. And actually what's been nice about that is the tenants have supported us in some of those areas. So that's been quite good to use example and case study. And if you wanted to look more about what we've done with the Great Crested Newt project, you can have a look on that link, which you'll see on the presentation. We continue to support the Swift Partnership. That was set up a few years ago with Leicestershire and Rutland Ornithological Society and all the local authorities in the area that have a responsibility for looking at planning, so that we can try and record the Swift nest sites and see where they are frequenting, so that we can encourage people making changes to their homes not to damage the sites. We recognise, like many species, that they're in decline, and we really need to take action on some of these key areas, and that's something we're committed to keep doing. And certainly in terms of parish councils, I think they could put a bit more pressure on districts to make sure that that's actually happening, but they need to know where they are and they need to be following it. You need to have people in each one really to actually follow it and ensure. Obviously the county ecologists do everything they can when planning applications come in, which is good, as long as they know where the sites may be that Swifts are using. And then we've just provided support letters to the Leafield Forest, and they've applied for a claim. If anybody's heard of the Climate Change Action Fund, which is all about improving biodiversity for to deal with the risk that it's going to need to have a far but higher opportunity of being resilient to climate change going forward. You know, in order to adapt, first of all, biodiversity needs to be resilient to the current pressures, let alone climate change. And but obviously it has its own impact in terms of the more woodland cover we have, and the better biodiverse grasslands that we have, the more carbon sequestration that we're going to have. So again, that's a project to try and improve the quality of the Leafield Forest and expand. And they're very much working with the Welland Partnership on that project, and the County Council want to have some involvement there because it might help to support wider amount of advice to farmers and so on, which would be really useful. So I think I've gone on quite a lot, and I'm hoping I've not missed off any of my points. But if anybody's got any questions, feel free to ask.
Okay, thanks very much, Lucie. If we just get people back up on screen, there we are. Wow, you've road verges and HS2. Gosh, I can see pitchforks and flaming torches. Controversial issues there. Has any questions for Lucie? Ray.
Lucie, it's Russell.
Yes.
Okay. Good stuff on the whole. I thought there were several elephants in the room that weren't mentioned. Housing, there shouldn't be anymore. We should be sharing them and using empty ones, not building anymore. We don't need them. Better Wi-Fi to reduce road use. What an investment that would be.
Yeah.
Very good news about you're talking about education. That's really important for everybody, and you've got a good emphasis there. And of course, less meat and dairy consumption, increase organic consumption. These are things which should be in there because they'll make such a difference. One other thing that you didn't mention, and that was wet boggy places. We have lost so many, and they're so important to the biodiversity. We really need more of those. I don't know how, but we need them. Okay. Good work on the road verges, that composting the grass. Surely there's money to be made. They can sell that compost, can't they? That would make a huge difference.
Yeah.
And I'm glad I thought I heard slight reservations in your voice about tree planting. I certainly have reservations. I like to see land that might be used for tree planting left so that it can just develop on its own way. No, trees will come, you know. I think that's the best way to manage that. A little bit of concern about the use of derelict land. Not at all happy about them, because there's such places for biodiversity.
I mentioned, yes, in terms of where I was referring to, there's a site in Measham which had an old garage on, literally, and and there's one. It's an application that came forward to take the concrete, literally concrete, and turn that into a community garden. So I get your point about derelict land, because it's very important for lots of species.
Yeah.
And you know,
couple of other
Gibson's
things.
an example there, isn't it, where you could do more to support some of the species on the old land. Yeah.
Could I just ask, are you aware, I've been working on it and still am, that at the end of the last century, 1980s, there was a huge survey, field by field survey of all the parishes of Leicestershire. And you're talking about evidence base. You've got a massive base of evidence there. Thousands and thousands of species, thousands of sites recorded by the county recorders at that time. The county staff. Yeah. So, and finally, just a little thing. You mentioned swifts, great. What about house martins?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Right,
well, they're another species, aren't they?
I've gone on a bit.
By development.
So, I've gone on a bit.
No, I welcome that. No, that's fine. Absolutely fine. Yeah.
Thanks anyway,
I think
Lucy.
for me, thank you.
Do you want to respond to any of Russell's other points? Do you want to say anything about tree planting as opposed to natural regeneration, for example?
Well, obviously, in terms of the discussion around rewilding, I think that's the point about letting things naturally succeed in the right way, in the right locations and so on. I think for me, where we're looking at tree planting and where we need to understand more of its importance is understanding the replacement of trees that are lost in where we're used to seeing them in hedgerow, you know, when we start to see ash dieback kicking in, the impact of that on the landscape and replacing trees there, whether we can do that in the same way as it had been done in the past. I think that's where we need to focus some of our discussion around tree planting. And, you know, if we can rewild areas and farmers are prepared to do that, that's great. But if we want to sort of, you know, in areas of new development, for example, where we talk about housing and so on, that is an opportunity to re-landscape sites or leave sites alone that are already in good quality, quite frankly, and change the design, which is better still. But those are the areas where I think we need to think more about planting trees and encouraging a change to the way we plant trees, particularly for future generations, because obviously new homes, new housing development, you could probably, I could think of lots of sites I know that don't have very many trees in the design at all, and that's a great pity, I think, in terms of connecting people with nature. So those are the sorts of areas, I think, where we talk about tree planting that we need to focus in on.
Okay, thanks. I've got one question from the chat window, but I think Ray, you had your hand up previously. Do you want to ask a question, and then I'll do the question from the chat?
Yes. Can you hear me, Alan?
Yeah.
This is very thought-provoking, and an evening for an hour or so is just not long enough. A weekend would be a start, I think. I have two specific questions about verges.
Yeah.
I have a concern that the council uses contractors for verge cutting. Even the parish councils do as well. What control is there over these people? Because sometimes I've seen them massacre verges. 10-foot wide verges are just taken all the way back to the hedge on a straight road that goes on for half a mile. Now, what controls do you exercise over your contractors? Do they have people going out and looking at their work?
Well, I suppose the first set of controls is the specification. And I think that's the point at which it starts. And then it's about clerks of works, as you've just pointed out, going and seeing what's done. And we do have people who have operational responsibility for those contracts, who go out and assess the work and take, you know, the contract is written and they then go and check. They have their own clerks of works when they've got, in certain cases, contractors have their own ecologists as well. So I think you're quite right. I think it's a process to make sure that the right specifications are in place, which they are, because I've seen them. Apart from the county council previously, there are specifications that can be followed, but the county council previously may not have done that for roadside verges, and now we're taking a different approach to looking at those specifications and saying, well, is it possible? Because it's realised that we have few spaces of good quality grassland across Leicestershire. You know, we've got something like 82% arable fields, intensive agriculture, intensively used. And I think we've got to look at this as an issue now. So it's about that, first of all, getting that management right, but making sure it's being done. And I think there's always an area for error, but it's a process about good specifications, the resources to be able to undertake it and to check it and to train the people on the tractors to make sure they understand what they've got to do properly. I think all those things, if you get that right,
it's the critical part is the operative doing the work. And
and then understanding.
Yeah. My second question was that I don't know if it's the case now, but there used to be designated verges which were protected, and they might have been classed as local wildlife sites. But local wildlife sites don't have any status in law at all. They're just a nice thing at all. How are we actually addressing verges which are, you know, at risk? No, this is perhaps more relevant in parts of Rutland, but there are sites around where I live that are, or there used to be, verges which actually has signs saying this is a protected verge.
Yeah, I think well, in terms of protection, if you can work out a way to protect the verge in terms of the methodology, as I said before, this rural trial is about, okay, we do cut and collect. Where do we? Sorry, my screen's gone. Where do we actually dispose? What sort of machinery do we need to collect? Have we got the right kit already within our within the contractor's portfolio of kit? And can we do it? And so, if you can do that, you can do it for wildlife sites potentially. If those, you know, if those pieces of machinery work on those particular topographies and those particular roads. And I think if you can do that, then you can protect the wildlife sites and more. Does that make sense? I think the issue of just protecting the wildlife sites in the past has meant you may not have applied you may have taken a bit more of an ad hoc approach to things, which isn't embedded into the general specification, and that's dangerous, isn't it? Because it's not a procedure.
The biggest danger.
If you find,
the biggest danger seems to be the lawnmower brigade, you might say. Thanks very much, Lucy. Very interesting.
Yeah.
Hey, thanks, Ray. So, still talking about grass cuttings, there's a question in the chat about other uses. So you talked about the possibility of anaerobic digestion, and I got the impression that wasn't going ahead. I guess that was ruled out on cost grounds.
Well, it's got nothing to do with cost at the moment, Alan. It's more about the lack of facilities in Leicestershire to take the grasses. At the moment, we not necessarily got enough sites that would take those grasses that are already in existence.
Right, but if you would go for anaerobic digestion, presumably you'd need a fairly big plant somewhere and then have to transport grass cuttings probably across the county to do
exactly.
Yeah.
And what we did look at was whether, first of all, how many plants, because we spoke to the Association of Anaerobic Biodigesters and they gave us some information around how many digestion plants there were in Leicestershire, where they were located, and whether they would take grasses, and it was very, very few. So from a logistics point of view, that isn't necessarily the best way. If we want to get something started, it's best to just look at composting sites, and as anaerobic digestion plants come online, we utilise that. In Lincolnshire, their approach was very much so the private sector had got certain digesters in place, and they, within a 20-kilometre radius of where they cut, they would go to those digesters. And it was basically the farmers clubbing together who managed those digesters, who applied to the Local Enterprise Partnership for funding to buy the kit to do the cut and collect, the suction, forage harvester type equipment. And that worked. The only snag they've got now is getting the right waste permit to dispose of the solid waste, because it's not considered grass cutting. Do you know what I mean? It's a waste product and it has to go under regulation that's not necessarily being created yet for that particular product from the Environment Agency. So they've hit a snag there, but if they overcome that, they can carry on. And then the other issue around it, which the Wildlife Trust made us aware in that part of the world, was they hadn't done masses of research on the impact to invertebrates. So they said, well, you could leave one side of the verge uncut and not cut it, and so they've got somewhere to relocate to, in effect. But actually, when they cut, they're sucking everything up into the machinery. So you could be denuding whole verges of things. And I think until they get more data on that to do something on a much bigger scale, that across the country, like a UK wide, you'd certainly need more of the digesters that were appropriate to take the waste. They need to sort out the regulations in terms of the permitting, and they would need to check that it's not got a disadvantage to biodiversity.
Yeah. So the other question in the chat was, could the cuttings be used as animal fodder?
In terms of what happens now when they go to green waste, I know a lot of it is used on farmland for spreading, to fertilise.
But not fodder.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess the answer to that is no, because presumably it's full of broken glass and those bits of wire that used to hold tire trims on that come off all the time. So
and it goes once it goes into the green waste plant, it's down to them to filter the cuttings really, and then decide what's of the right quality to go where. So
if I was Parish Council then, and I wanted to get a Shire Environment grant, I'd write a composting one, and I'd say we're going to compost all the grass cuttings from the parish.
Well, you could, and that was something we discussed back in the office, is that there's not many community compost sites.
Yeah.
And although need licensing and so on, that would help, wouldn't it? Because then you would have more places to dispose of cuttings, even from the grass verges that our rural grass cutters would do. So yeah, but it's that will, isn't it? First of all, to find a location, and then to manage the site. I know certainly where I live, it goes to a company called Pounders, which are further down the way. We collect the grass cuttings, and it goes there as green waste. So, but these are all licensed green waste sites that they would go to, that are already in operation.
Yeah. Okay. Anyone got any more questions? Does anyone want to ask Lucy about trees? Maybe we could get away from road verges. Yes. I'm sorry, I don't know your full name. Charla, you're coming up.
Well, that's the wife's name. My name's John, by the way. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi, Lucy. Very enlightening. You've kind of like restored my faith nearly in the ecology department of LCC. Can we go back to Verges? Sorry.
Can I'll just correct you. I'm not an ecologist, but I work in the environment team.
Okay.
but we do have a county ecologist team. Yes.
Okay. Well, yeah, just convey my message, please, to them. We go back to Verges and the question about animal feed. Years ago, grass verges were cut with reciprocating blade, which allowed a good length of material, which was then baled. And the farmers used to go mad over it because it was really nutrient rich. Maybe that's one way to go, but a problem would be litter and plastics in the verges. I have this idea, Lucy, which is a little frame, an idea of it is if we could divert the budget from grass cutting, say for, I don't know, 3 years, divert it into litter picking, have a deep clean of the verges, because they haven't been cleaned, I don't know, since litter was created. Would that be potentially possible, do you think?
To divert the budget, I suppose there's a few issues with that. I mean, they're doing a full cut this year to make sure that they've got rid of woody growth, because it needs doing. It's time for that to be done, and that will help expose areas where there will be litter that's probably been there for a while, that's not been found or collected. But to divert the budget, I think that would go too far, because obviously you wouldn't be able to keep on top of the verges. It would go against the idea of the biodiversity work that we're trying to achieve, because then you're not reducing the nutrients and you're not allowing certain species to thrive, etc., etc. So there'll be lots of issues. I think collecting litter is probably more of an issue, really. How do we collect it? After cuts, maybe. Is there more that can be done about community litter picking? I mean, it's a constant problem, you know. It's Highways England have this issue, and they tend to sort of have a blitz on certain strips of road, and that's the sort of approach that's needed, really, I think, on a regular basis, because it's constant. You know, it's never static.
No. I see it's reoccurred just recently with the opening of certain fast food retail outlets, hasn't it? I don't know if you've noticed.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and the issue of plastic bottles in the verges that get thrown out of windows is a big issue too.
Well, yeah, I mean,
I think the answer really is people being responsible at the end of the day and not causing a litter.
Yes,
but
well,
if we can try and find ways of getting people out there, maybe. And it's difficult on roads that are high fast roads as well, because of the health and safety of people going out litter picking is hard. Well, and that's part of the reason why it takes so long for the county, because they have to potentially put safety measures in to get to those spaces as well.
Well, the vehicles, they've created the litter, so as far as I can see, they can slow down for an hour just so it can get collected. Anyway, yeah, thanks, Lucy, for that.
Yeah.
The Shire Environment Grant. Now,
yes,
is that applied for via the Parish Council or by a community?
Right. So I'll send that presentation I've just done, because I think there was a link on there to the grant webpage. Any community group can apply. So if you go onto the website on the Leicestershire County Council, it tells you what to do.
Yeah.
So you could be, you don't have to be a parish council, you could be a community interest company. As long as you've got a bank account, you could be just an association in a sense.
Right.
As long as you can prove that where you're doing the project, you've got permission. I mean, all the criteria is on there, but it does need to be land that is public land in a sense. It's not private land.
Yeah, parish council.
You couldn't do it in your back garden. Yeah.
Yeah.
And you know, the big thing about it is engaging with people, getting them involved, so that you're spreading the word about why you're doing it, as well as the work that you're doing. And we're trying through the biodiversity stuff to encourage people to really look at the record office before they do any work, to check that they understand what's there first, because people can look at a site, and we've had this where they don't necessarily know that there's something important there already. And they think by improving it, it goes back to the discussion earlier about derelict land and how you can have unintended negative consequences of trying to be helpful. And so I think that's something I would always encourage people, is to look at where they are, assess what's there in terms of flora and fauna in the current time, go back and look at the evidence and make sure you're not going to do anything that cause a problem. But then often, you know, like putting back boxes up in the right location that then are going to be looked after, not just left to deteriorate. It has to be sustainable as well. You've got to look after it. You know, bird boxes, those sorts of things are great because there's always more of that. But improving habitat is what we really want to see, and particularly we talked about local wildlife sites. We could work with landowners who've got public land that are wildlife sites to try and improve them and the quality and the management of them. That's perfect.
Yes. Well, there's just a little project. It's in its infancy here. It's just an old filled-in pond, which is parish council.
Yeah.
Been backfilled 30 years ago. So we're thinking just get it going again, dig it out, reintroduce it. We'll just let them reintroduce themselves. But obviously,
absolutely,
yeah.
We'll
but there's a cost. There's a cost to that, isn't there? So
yes,
yeah.
We will share Lucie's presentation on the Nature Spot website, and I'll send it round to the email address of everyone who's registered. So you will have all of the links that she showed in her presentation.
Lovely stuff. Thanks.
So thanks for that. We've got another hand up in the chat room for a question.
Hi, yeah, it's Ed Darby. Hi, Lucie.
Hello, you all right?
Yeah, get that off my screen. Yeah, okay. I noticed on the County Council website there was a reference to spraying against weeds, and I wondered if there were proposals to change that policy in any way whatsoever.
Yeah, the County Council is in the process. I think it'd be safe to say that we're rewriting our sustainability plan for the way we work on our property. So I think pesticides are in question already on that score. So you may see that change.
Yeah, and if I could just ask a follow-up. Do I take it the environment strategy, which runs to 2030, that the proposals and ideas that you've talked about this evening place by 2030?
You'll have to say that last bit again, Ed, because you went off. It sort of froze for a moment. So I got to the bit with 2030, but then I lost you. It just froze.
I was wondering, you know, when people talk about policy, often they're talking about what they hope to do rather than what they necessarily intend to see completed. And so I wondered, all the issues that you've been talking about, the proposals that you have in mind, whether the intention is that they should be completed and in place by 2030.
From my perspective, Ed, in terms of the engagement I've done to date with different service areas, like country parks and property and so on, I've had quite in-depth conversations. It's about what we can achieve, so it's got to be realistic, it's got to be smart. And for me, if we can pinpoint those things and get on with those things, then they will be done by 2030. See what I mean?
Thanks.
It's no good setting unrealistic targets, because we need to make sure we get things done. So what my view very much is, if we're not doing this now, why not? Can it be done? If it's just about changing a process or reintroducing new knowledge to help get something done, and we can do that, then it gets put in the policy and we get on with it. And I think that approach is something which will mean we get some targeted things delivered.
Yeah,
Does
thanks,
that
Lucy.
explain things for you?
Well, yeah, I'll keep my fingers crossed.
Yeah. Well, there are some things that, of course, people I would say, I want to do this, this, and this, but the reality is, well, there is no resource for that, either pulling it in externally or within the local authorities' gift. So I think we have to be realistic about what we achieve, but at the end of the day, we do need to push the boundaries. There are lots of things, I feel, that are potential things that can be done that just haven't been. Does that make sense? And are straightforward to get on with. I think those are important now.
Okay,
Yeah.
I think we've probably got time for possibly one more question, if there's anybody else. I'm desperate for someone to ask a question about trees, but nobody's asking about trees. So
Can I ask a question about trees, Alan?
yeah, you can ask a question about trees.
Having put a few questions to Chief Planning Officer of our local council regards protection of trees, enhancement of trees, I came across a brick wall, and the brick wall was called the NPPF, National Planning Policy Framework, and it was quoted to me all the time where there's no protection included in that, or scope for enhancement of building sites or general areas. So should we be influencing the NPPF somehow? Because that's like the controlling body, especially on planning applications.
Yeah. Well, in terms of the NPPF, there will be more changes to come to that, of course, with the new Environment Bill. Has anybody from the group had a look at that bill? Because I think it's worth, if you're interested in the nuts and bolts of how government works on the environment, it's worth having a look at that. Because if we hadn't have had COVID-19, the new Environment Bill would be in place. And what that does stipulate is a 10% net gain for biodiversity, right? And so if there's an area that has is valuable with trees in it, and there's a development coming along, then what you would want to see is a gain on that habitat. So you want to be expecting more trees in the landscape of that area than less. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, perfect.
So there is that, but I mean there is their expectation already for to try and get net gain on development. It just doesn't specify amount. And obviously ecologists, when they look at planning applications, they'll see what's important, what's protected, and they'll look for TPO trees. But if there are trees that aren't TPO'd, haven't got a tree preservation order on, or there are, and they are veteran trees, there are trees of significance, then the ecologists will pull them out. And I think what's worth looking at if you're in Leicestershire is the tree management strategy, because that does tell you what our influence at the county council is around trees. So, for example, with regards to new roads being developed within housing developments, we have a say in that as a local authority because we have responsibility for transport. And in that sense, we have a responsibility for understanding roadside trees and what the impact on trees in that landscape. So, and then it's going back to your district and saying, do you have a policy on trees in design? Do you have a design policy for biodiversity?
I don't think
the
I
landscape.
No.
So that's interesting. I know Hinckley and Bosworth have got a design guide for development which talks about this, and it might be worth having a look at that and showing your local authority. I don't know where you are.
So,
but then also there's, if you look on their website, their design guides on there. But the other thing is the neighbourhood plans.
Oh yes.
They have Sayers Way because they say where they want development to go. It's not about stopping development, but it's very much about where they want development. And they also say, and we want more of this. We want to see more of this type of design where we might want more trees. We want to see, and those are the levers I think that you can pull really.
Yes, well, ours is just going out to final tick off, final
referendum. Yeah.
We'll see what happens on that front. Right, okay.
And of course, if you see a tree which you think is of importance and value, you can contact the local planning authority and say, well, you know, under these guidelines, the county council quote the importance of veteran and mature trees in the landscape, and if there are things like bats or birds' nests, they, in their sense, protect the tree because, you know, depending on when the development is about to take place, you can't interrupt those species, can you?
No. Well, I have tried that, but it was poo-pooed under health and safety. So that was what they used, the health and safety bracket, to chop it down. It was about 110-year-old. What do you call it? I can't remember now.
They said it was diseased or something, did they?
No. It was on them. It was in a factory premises, and even though the factory's been there since 1927, along with the tree, they all of a sudden decided it had to go. So I approached our local boys, local planning, and they said, well, unless it's got a TPO on it, there's no jurisdiction to refuse it. It's gone now. Never mind.
And you can have a TPO put on it if you feel like there's enough people who think it has an amenity value as well as.
Yes.
But then you need to get the tree officer on your side and speak to them and get them out there to look at it. And you can call planning applications in, can't you?
Right. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So instead of it being delegated authority, it becomes the committee of the planning committee.
That goes to the
members.
Yes. Yeah. You just got to get 10 votes against it. It'll go to committee. But
yeah, fine. Yeah.
I didn't get that. Anyway, never mind. Right. Okay. I'll leave you to it. Thank you very much. So,
thank you to everyone. I think it's probably time that we draw this to a close this evening. Thanks to you all for turning up and asking questions. Thanks especially to Lucie for putting herself on the line, never knowing what she was going to be asked this evening. I hope you get a lot more applications as a result of this. And I hope that a lot of people will want to maybe talk to their parish councils if they've got contacts on their parish councils and getting involved in the various schemes that you've told us about tonight. So once again, Lucie, thank you very much, and thank you to everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks for inviting me.